Ladies and gentlemen, you are not ready for what I'm about to tell you. Because the prison walls that were supposed to keep things under control just turned into the set of the wildest, bloodiest reality show you've never seen on Netflix. Minutes, yes minutes, after Lil Durk was handed the ultimate sentence in Vaughn's murder case, the calm, cold courtroom energy turned into a war zone inside the prison. I'm talking fists flying, shanks flashing, and a roar so loud it could have been the opening act for a Kanye West concert gone wrong. Now ask yourself, how does a man go from smirking in front of a judge to fighting for his life in less than the time it takes to heat up instant noodles? Coincidence? Or was this attack planned, orchestrated, and greenlit by people who wanted Durk gone before he could even process the words death penalty? Some say it was revenge for Vaughn. Others whisper about a bounty placed on his head the moment the verdict dropped. And the craziest part? My sources tell me the guards didn't just fail to stop it, they might have helped make it happen. This isn't justice. This is prison politics at its most savage. The moment the judge's gavel slammed down, sealing Lil Durk's fate with those two chilling words, death penalty, you could feel the air get heavier. Cameras in the courtroom caught him leaning back, smirking like he had just won a Grammy instead of being handed the deadliest sentence in the legal playbook. But what the cameras didn't show was what was brewing behind those prison walls, a storm that had been gathering for months, just waiting for this exact moment to explode. See, people think prison riots just happen out of nowhere. Wrong. They're orchestrated like concerts, with headliners, opening acts, and a finale that leaves everyone talking. And in this case, Durk wasn't just a main attraction, he was the reason the whole show started. From the moment news of the verdict hit the prison yard, it was like someone rang the bell at the start of a boxing match. Inmates began whispering, old beefs reignited, and gang alliances that had been simmering quietly suddenly boiled over. Some claimed it was about respect, others about revenge, but the word on the inside was clear. Tonight, Durk wasn't going to sleep peacefully. You gotta understand, Durk's arrival in prison was already controversial. This wasn't just any high-profile inmate. This was a man with a public persona of untouchable swagger. Someone whose music glorified the very violence he was now paying the ultimate price for. And let's not forget, there were still people inside who blamed him directly for King Vaughn's death. Prison has its own code, and in their eyes, this verdict was more than just justice. It was a green light. Anonymous sources, and by anonymous, I mean people who would 100% deny ever talking to me if you asked them, claim that the moment Durk stepped back into his cell block after sentencing, the tension was visible. Guards walked slower. Conversation stopped when he passed, and a few inmates gave him looks so cold you'd think they were auditioning for a horror movie. And then there's the rumor, and you didn't hear this from me, that a welcome party had already been arranged. Not the kind with balloons and cake, but the kind where you might not walk out alive. My source said it was all triggered by a single phone call from an inmate in another facility, someone who had history with Vaughn and connections to the streets. Allegedly, that call promised that whoever got a Durk first would be taken care of on the outside. But here's where it gets even more twisted. This wasn't just about Vaughn. There were people in the prison who saw Durk as a walking target for clout. Imagine the bragging rights. I took down Lil Durk. In prison currency, that's worth more than any commissary snack or gang favor you could dream of. Now, if you're wondering where the guards were in all this, oh, they were there. They were watching. But the thing about prison guards is sometimes watching doesn't mean stopping. My insider says that the guards have been told to stand down if things got physical, that this was inmate business and not worth risking themselves over. And that's where the conspiracy theories start to take root. Because some people believe the guards wanted Durk gone just as badly as the inmates did. Maybe it was because of his arrogance in court. Maybe because they didn't want the hassle of a high-profile prisoner who could cause media headaches. Or maybe, just maybe, someone higher up gave the order. Remember, this is the same prison where, last year, a notorious gang leader accidentally ended up in the same rec yard as a rival. 10 minutes later, one was on a stretcher. No one saw anything. No cameras worked. And the official report? Inmate altercation under investigation. Sure. And I'm the Queen of England. So here's how the setup began. Durk returns from court, still smirking like he's untouchable. The block is quiet, too quiet. He walks through his cell, drops his court-issued paperwork on the bed, and starts pacing. 2 guards at the far end pretend to be chatting, but they keep glancing his way. An inmate known only as Ghost leans against the wall, tapping his foot in a slow, deliberate rhythm. And then, like a signal, 3 other inmates begin drifting closer. Now, if you've ever been in a prison, and hopefully you haven't, you know that inmates don't just drift without reason. Movement is calculated. Body language is everything. And in that moment, every move said the same thing. Something's about to go down. Ghost steps forward first, casual, like he's just coming over to talk. But the words out of his mouth aren't friendly. According to a source who overheard it, Ghost said, "That smirk ain't gonna save you here, rapper boy." And before Durk could even react, the first punch landed. What followed was chaos. 2 more inmates rushed in, one swinging a makeshift blade fashioned from a sharpened toothbrush. Another tried to grab Durk by the neck, while Ghost kept landing punches to his ribs. Durk fought back. And yes, say what you want about him, but the man can throw a punch. He landed at least 2 solid hits before he was overwhelmed. Guards? Still watching. And here's the kicker. My source swears one of them was actually smiling. I'm not saying it's true, but when you hear the same detail from 3 different people who don't even like each other, you start to wonder. The noise drew other inmates to their cell doors, banging on the bars, shouting, some cheering, some warning him to cover up. And then, just when it looked like this was going to end badly for Durk, a loud, sharp whistle cut through the chaos. Everything froze. Ghost stepped back, the blade disappeared, and the attackers melted into the crowd like they had never been there. The guards finally moved in, but not to check on Durk, to tell him to get up and stop causing trouble. Imagine that. The man's bleeding from his mouth, his shirt's torn, and somehow he's the one being told to calm down. And here's where the plot thickens. Less than 5 minutes after the fight ended, Durk was moved to a different section of the prison. Not solitary, not protective custody, just somewhere else. And guess what? No incident report was filed. None. As far as the official record is concerned, nothing happened that day except routine inmate movement. But I've been doing this long enough to know that when something disappears from the official record, it's because someone doesn't want it found. And in this case, that someone might be a lot higher up the chain than a couple of lazy guards. Which brings us to the question no one wants to ask out loud. Was this attack just the beginning? Because according to my source, that welcome party was only phase 1 of a plan that could make Durk's final days inside hell on earth. And if what I'm hearing is true, phase 2 was already set in motion before the blood from phase 1 had even dried. And that's exactly where things started to get darker. Because while everyone on the outside thought Durk's biggest problem was the death penalty, inside, his biggest problem was surviving long enough to even reach the execution chamber. Because in prison, death penalty doesn't always mean the state gets you first. Sometimes the inmates beat them to it. And in Durk's case, there were too many people who wanted their shot before the clock ran out. Phase 2 of the so-called plan wasn't about sending a message that had already been delivered with fists and blades. This was about humiliation, about stripping him of every shred of respect he'd carried in from the outside world. My source told me that word spread quickly. Durk was marked for PC status, protective custody, which, in prison hierarchy, is basically social death. You're seen as weak, untouchable in all the wrong ways, and every gang knows you're no longer a player in the main game. But here's the thing, Durk didn't take the bait. Instead of asking for protection, he doubled down. He started walking the yard like nothing had happened. Bruises visible, lips swollen, shirt collar stretched, but his head held high, almost daring someone to try again. And that only made things worse. Because in the twisted logic of prison politics, acting unafraid is like throwing gasoline on a fire. Now, it wasn't just the ones with personal grudges. It was guys who just wanted to prove they could take down the fearless rapper. And if you think that didn't make the prison staff nervous, think again. You could see it in their eyes, a mix of annoyance and anticipation, like they knew another explosion was coming, but they weren't in a rush to stop it. One anonymous guard, we'll call him Red, told me over the phone that by the second day after the verdict, bets were already being placed in the staff lounge about how long Durk would last. I'm not making this up. There were actual cash pools going, with dates written on slips of paper and the prize sitting in a locked cigar box in the corner. Disgusting? Absolutely. Surprising? Not in the slightest. And if you think the violence was contained inside the walls, you're wrong. Outside on the streets, Durk's crew was scrambling. The same people who had paraded their loyalty online were suddenly silent. Some deleted old posts. Others stopped answering calls from his legal team. One former associate even went live on Instagram claiming he brought this on himself. A clip that, according to my source, was passed around inside the prison like a victory lap. But let's rewind for a second, because you need to understand how deep this vendetta went. Months before the trial even started, there had been whispers that Durk was papered. Prison slang for having snitched, whether true or not. In most places, that's instant danger. Add to that the fact that many still blamed him for the chain of events that led to Vaughn's death. And you got a man walking into a cage full of wolves wearing a stake suit. Now, I've seen inmates get targeted before, but this was different. There was a level of coordination here that screamed outside involvement. According to Red, someone had been putting money into certain inmates' commissary accounts in the weeks leading up to the verdict. The timing? Too perfect to ignore. These weren't friends helping friends. These were payments. Payments for loyalty. Payments for silence. And maybe payments for action. Day 3 after the verdict is when Phase 2 officially began. Durk was heading back from the mess hall, flanked by 2 guards. Everything seemed calm. And then, out of nowhere, an inmate tossed a tray of steaming food right into his face. The shock made him stumble, and that's when 2 others rushed him. No knives this time, just pure, calculated aggression. Punches to the head, kicks to the ribs, a knee to the gut that left him gasping. The guards? Again, slow to react. Almost too slow. When they finally pulled the attackers away, Durk was barely standing. But here's the most chilling detail. As they dragged him toward the infirmary, one of the attackers was overheard saying, "Next time, we finish it." And if you're wondering whether the prison investigated, don't make me laugh. The official report? Inmate altercation over spilled food. No mention of the previous incident. No connection made. It was almost like they wanted to erase the pattern before anyone outside caught on. Meanwhile, in the outside world, fans were losing their minds. Hashtags demanding justice for Durk started trending. But just as quickly, a counterwave of posts popped up. People celebrating the attacks, calling it street karma. Twitter threads dissected his old lyrics, quoting lines about betrayal and revenge, then linking them to his current situation. Even TikTok got on it, with users making parody skits of Durk getting checked in prison. The line between news and entertainment had blurred completely. Inside, though, the mood was far from comedic. My source says Durk was given a new cellmate after the second attack. A quiet, older man doing life without parole for triple homicide. On the surface, it looked like a safety move. In reality, people suspected this man was planted there to keep tabs on Durk, or worse. The guy had connections to multiple gangs and a reputation for being a clean-up man. In prison, that term doesn't mean janitor. By the end of the first week, Durk's legal team was pushing for him to be transferred. They argued that his high profile made him a target and that the prison wasn't taking adequate measures to protect him. But transfers take time Durk might not have had, especially with Phase 3 of the plan looming. Here's the bombshell my source dropped. Phase 3 wasn't going to be a fight. It wasn't going to be a stabbing. It was going to be something quieter, harder to trace, a medical incident in prison. That can mean anything from food poisoning to a conveniently timed overdose. And according to whispers, the setup for that had already started. Certain kitchen workers have been asking suspicious questions about Durk's meal preferences. Others notice a sudden change in the cleaning crew assigned to his block. Too many small shifts happening too close together. When I pressed Red about it, he went silent for a full 30 seconds before saying, "If I were him, I wouldn't eat anything I didn't open myself." That's not something a guard says lightly. So while the outside world debated whether Durk deserved the death penalty, the inside world was asking a different question. Would he even live long enough to face it? Because if my sources are right, the ones running this plan weren't interested in letting the state have the final say. They wanted the story to end their way. And the craziest part? According to one anonymous inmate letter I received, the riot that would follow Phase 3 was already being planned. Not just a small scuffle, a full-blown, block-wide eruption that would distract from whatever happened to Durk. In other words, cover for the final act, which leads us straight into the night everything boiled over. When the whispers turned into shouts, the tension turned into chaos, and the prison became a war zone. Forget the slow burn tension of the days before. This was an explosion. Sirens blaring, boots pounding against concrete, the smell of pepper spray already thick in the air before most inmates even knew what was happening. And at the center of it all, Lil Durk, backed into a corner of the yard with nowhere to run. It started with shouts, not the usual back and forth you hear in a place like this. These were guttural, raw, the kind that make your spine tighten. Fists started pounding on the metal tables, a sound like distant thunder rolling across the yard. Then came the first punch, thrown not at Durk, but between two other inmates. A distraction. Within seconds, it was chaos. Guards tried to form a line, but they were outnumbered before they even stepped in. Inmates surged forward. Some tried to get to Durk, others just taking advantage of the mayhem to settle their own scores. It was impossible to tell who was on whose side. It didn't matter. In that moment, everyone was a target. Durk was moving, ducking, weaving to the crowd like he was back in one of his own music videos. Only this time there was no retake, no security detail to pull him out. He caught sight of Ghost. Yes, the same Ghost in the first attack, coming toward her with that same slow, deliberate walk. Only now, Ghost had something in his hand. The weapon was crude but deadly. A piece of sharpened metal, wrapped with tape for grip. In prison, they call it a bone crusher. Durk knew what that meant. One hit, and you're not walking away. He backed up, trying to keep distance, but the crowd closed him like a funnel. Here's where things get really suspicious. Just as Ghost closed the gap, two other inmates from a completely different gang stepped in between them, shoving Ghost back. They didn't do it to save Durk out of kindness. No, this was about control. The fight for who got to take him down had turned into its own power struggle. While those three went at it, Durk slipped toward the fence, looking for an opening. But then, and my source swears this happened, a guard unlocked one of the side gates, not for Durk to escape, but to let in another wave of inmates from a different block. Tell me that's not suspicious. Within minutes, the yard was a swirling mess of bodies, shouts, and blood. Durk was slammed against the fence, fists raining down, and at one point, someone grabbed his hair and yanked his head back so hard it made a sound like Velcro ripping. He threw elbows, ducked punches, even landed a knee to someone's stomach. But the sheer numbers were overwhelming. Then came the sound, a deep, booming crack that silenced everything for a split second. A warning shot. The guards had finally decided to use live rounds to break it up. That single shot didn't hit anyone, but it changed the energy instantly. Inmates froze, then scattered, the way pigeons take off when a car horn blares. Durk was pulled to the ground by two guards, cuffed and dragged out of the yard. And here's the detail that doesn't sit right with me. Instead of taking him to the infirmary, they took him to the administrative wing. No cameras, no witnesses, just Durk, two guards, and a locked door. My source inside claims that what happened in that wing was worse than anything in the yard. Not physical violence, but threats. Real, cold, calculated threats. According to the account, a high-ranking officer leaned over the table and told Durk, "You've got two options. Leave here in a box on our time, or make your peace with the needle." The message was clear. The state might have sentenced him to death, but the prison had its own schedule. By the time Durk was returned to his cell that night, the riot was officially over. At least, that's what the report said. The truth? The riot had achieved exactly what was meant to. It isolated Durk, stripped him of whatever protection he thought he had, and made it clear that no one inside those walls was going to save him. Outside, the media went wild. News outlets ran blurry footage from contraband cell phones, showing flashes of Durk in the chaos, his white shirt streaked with red, his face twisted in pain and fury. Social media split into two camps again. Hashtag Free Durk started trending alongside hashtag Durk got what he deserved. Everyone had an opinion, and no one had the full story. But let's not forget, Phase 3 wasn't about the riot. The riot was cover. My source says that while the yard descended into madness, something else happened in the kitchen. A certain tray, marked for Durk, was prepared with a little extra ingredient. And I'm not talking about seasoning. The kind of extra that doesn't show up in a standard toxicology test, unless you know exactly what to look for. The problem for whoever planned it? Durk never ate that meal. Whether it was luck, instinct, or just stubbornness, he refused the tray when it finally made its way to his cell. He asked for sealed items instead, packaged snacks from the commissary. It was the first smart move he'd made since stepping into that place. Of course, the kitchen crew wasn't happy. Rumor has it the inmate responsible for prepping the tray was furious, saying, "We had one shot." And that one shot had just slipped away. But in prison, patience isn't a virtue, it's a necessity. If they couldn't get him that day, there was always tomorrow. Meanwhile, Durk's lawyers doubled down on their transfer request, citing the riot as undeniable proof that his life was in danger. The prison's official stance? Mr. Banks was not the target of any coordinated action. Sure, and my goldfish can drive a car. Still, the pressure was mounting. Outside activists started calling for federal oversight, alleging that the prison was intentionally allowing, if not facilitating, violence against high-profile inmates. A senator even made a statement, saying, "Every individual, regardless of their crimes, is entitled to safety while in state custody." Noble words, but words don't stop knives. Inside, Durk's reality was simpler. Survive the night, then survive the next one. He started sleeping in shifts, one eye open back against the wall. His cellmate, the quiet lifer, remained unreadable, sometimes helpful, sometimes staring at Durk with a look that could mean anything. And so the days crawled by, each one feeling like it could be the last. The verdict had sealed his fate in the eyes of the law. But in the eyes of the prison, that fate could be sped up at any moment. Whether by riot, by blade, or by something slipped into his food, the end was always a possibility lingering in the air. Which brings us to the question I've been asking since this story started. Will Lil Durk ever make it to the execution chamber? Or will the prison politics, the grudges, and the payback culture take him out first? Because from everything my sources have told me, one thing is certain. The fight isn't over. Not by a long shot. And that, my friends, is where we leave Lil Durk. For now, bruised, battered, and trapped in a system that seems less interested in justice and more obsessed with playing executioner on its own schedule. The judge may have pronounced the death penalty, but inside those walls, the real sentence is survival, and every day is another roll of the dice. So, I have to ask you, do you honestly believe Durk will live long enough to face a needle? Or are we looking at another so-called mysterious prison death that gets swept under the rug with a one-line press release? Because if history has taught us anything, it's that high-profile inmates don't just pass away quietly. There's always more to the story. Always. And what about those guards? Were they just incompetent, or were they part of the script? The unlocked gate, the delayed response, the smug looks, is it all coincidence, or are we watching a carefully choreographed takedown? The kind of takedown that sends a message to anyone else who thinks they can walk into prison with a smirk and walk out alive. Now it's your turn. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Durk's enemies inside will strike again? Was a riot a spontaneous eruption, or was it cover for something far deadlier? And most importantly, if you were in his shoes, what would you do to survive? Don't just watch the story, be part of it. Hit that like button if you want the unfiltered truth the mainstream won't touch. Smash subscribe so you never miss the next explosive update. And share this with someone who still thinks prison is just doing time. Trust me, after this, you'll never look at it the same way again. Because here at Celebrity Press, the truth isn't just told, it's exposed.